The neighborhood had the kind of beauty that made real estate brochures look modest. Perfectly trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, flowers arranged in ways that seemed measured with a ruler. Every driveway was clean, every hedge was sculpted, and the streets were smooth enough to reflect sunlight. To anyone driving through, it looked like peace, order, and quiet prosperity. But beneath the neat lines and coordinated house colors, there was something else, something that whispered instead of shouted. A tension that hid in neighborly smiles. A strictness disguised as community pride. And at the center of it all stood the Homeowners Association and its president. The president, a man named Harold, was known in the neighborhood long before the narrator arrived. He was the type of person who believed rules were not just guidelines, but sacred scripture. He walked the streets each morning, coffee in hand, clipboard tucked under his arm, scanning the neighborhood like a security guard reviewing camera footage. He noticed everything. A lawn that grew 1 inch too high. A trash bin placed a few inches outside the approved hours. Fence paint that looked slightly faded. And he did not simply enforce the rules, he enforced them with personal joy. When the narrator bought the house, it wasn't because of the HOA. It was because of the quiet surroundings and the old oak tree that stretched its branches over the backyard like a protective canopy. The house needed some work, but it had character, and there was something comforting about its imperfections. The narrator, having worked through the tiring grind of city life and corporate legal battles, was looking for peace. A place where the world didn't feel like a competition. A home that offered stillness. The neighbors seemed polite at first. They offered brief waves, occasional nods, and the shared unspoken acknowledgement of suburban routine. The mailbox became the new water cooler. The backyard porch became the new sanctuary. It was a slow, steady process of settling in. Until the first envelope arrived. It was a neatly folded letter stamped with the HOA's emblem. A notice. A reminder that the narrator's trash can had been left visible from the street for longer than the permitted 2-hour window. The narrator didn't think too much of it. Rules were rules, and mistakes happened. But the tone of the notice felt colder than expected. It didn't sound like a community reminder. It sounded like a warning. Soon after came another letter. Then another. The mailbox began filling with printed envelopes more frequently than advertisements. Each one pointed out another supposed violation. The lawn was half an inch too long. The paint on the front door didn't match the approved palette listed in the neighborhood rulebook. A small garden light in the front yard was an unauthorized decorative illumination. At first, the narrator simply corrected the issues, assuming it would stop. But the notices didn't stop. If anything, they increased. What made it stranger was how selective the enforcement seemed to be. While the narrator's mailbox filled with warnings, other houses clearly violated the same rules without consequence. A house down the street had a broken fence panel for months. Another home had 3 trash cans permanently stored outside. Yet neither of those homeowners seemed to receive any reprimand. When the narrator tried to bring it up casually, it became clear that this wasn't oversight, it was targeted. The neighbors' reactions became more telling over time. Some of them avoided eye contact. Some simply gave sympathetic looks. A few tried to offer subtle warnings without openly speaking against the HOA. They all seemed to share a common understanding. Harold, the president, chose targets. And once someone was chosen, the HOA turned into something relentless. But Harold did not know who the narrator really was. To him, the narrator was just another homeowner, someone who would cave, comply, and quietly accept the pressure. He did not know the narrator was a lawyer. A meticulous, experienced lawyer who had spent years analyzing contracts, interpreting legal frameworks, and navigating bureaucratic systems far more complex than a suburban HOA. The narrator didn't reveal this fact. Not yet. Because lawyers learn early in their careers that timing matters more than words. There is power in watching, understanding, and waiting. The breaking point came in the form of a fine. Not a warning this time, but an actual monetary penalty. A penalty for unauthorized exterior alterations. The so-called alteration was a simple garden trellis placed near the side fence. A trellis so small and ordinary that it would barely be noticeable to anyone not intentionally looking for it. Yet the fine was significantly larger than any previous notice would suggest. The letter was worded in a way that attempted authority. It insisted that failure to pay would result in additional fines, property liens, and potential legal action. It was written with intimidation in mind, the kind of intimidation that worked on most people. But the narrator was not most people. Instead of reacting, the narrator began collecting. Every letter, every notice, every timestamp, every photograph, every conversation. The narrator began reviewing the HOA bylaws, not the short pamphlet distributed to homeowners, but the full legal document filed with the county. The narrator requested records of board meeting minutes, which were public by law. The narrator quietly researched the HOA's financial history and discovered something noteworthy. Several expenses listed under administrative funds were unusually high and lacked proper documentation. Piece by piece, the puzzle took shape. It revealed not only selective enforcement, but possible financial mismanagement. And perhaps more importantly, it revealed a pattern of targeting homeowners who questioned the HOA, or who simply didn't fall into line fast enough. The narrator didn't reveal anything yet. Instead, the narrator simply smiled the next time Harold walked past the house, clipboard in hand, scanning the property as though waiting to pounce. Harold believed he held absolute authority. He had no idea the ground beneath him was about to shift. Because the narrator was not preparing to argue. The narrator was preparing to dismantle. The story of this neighborhood was no longer about grass heights or mailbox standards. It was moving toward something larger, something sharper, something inevitable. And Harold was entirely unaware that the person he targeted was someone trained to win. The days that followed unfolded quietly on the surface, yet every moment held purpose. The narrator had begun to watch the neighborhood more closely, noticing details that once blended into the background. The daily strolls of residents, the subtle expressions exchanged between neighbors, the way certain houses received gentle reminders while others received threats. The subdivision was less a peaceful community and more a system of unspoken politics, all orbiting around Harold's authority. The narrator kept a notebook now, though it never left the desk drawer unless needed. Each incident, no matter how small, was written down. Dates, times, descriptions. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. A lawyer's habit of building a case brick by brick. Patterns were not always obvious at first, but once enough data was collected, they revealed themselves with clarity. It became clear that certain homeowners were favored. Their violations, if acknowledged at all, resulted in polite warnings written in soft language. Others, however, like the narrator, faced fines written with a tone meant to intimidate. The distinction seemed personal rather than procedural. And the reason was whispered about more often than spoken. Harold preferred obedience, not cooperation. Those who joined committees, attended HOA meetings, or complimented Harold's rigid management style were treated well. Those who valued independence, privacy, or questioned the rigidity of the rules were marked. The narrator walked the neighborhood one afternoon, taking slow, careful steps, stopping occasionally to note fence conditions, yard decorations, and various elements that technically violated the written HOA codes. The narrator was not planning to report these violations. They were evidence that enforcement was inconsistent and therefore legally challengeable. The narrator did not simply want the fines removed. The narrator intended to expose the hypocrisy itself. Meanwhile, the letters grew more aggressive. The latest stated that the narrator had failed to repaint the mailbox to meet the neighborhood's aesthetic uniformity standard. The mailbox was clean, well-maintained, and identical in style to many others on the street. Yet the letter described it as visibly fading. The narrator inspected it closely and found no fading at all. But the language of the letter wasn't about accuracy, it was about asserting control. Even the neighbors had begun to notice the steady stream of HOA envelopes. Some offered quiet nods of sympathy during morning walks. Others avoided involvement, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. Only one neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA existed, offered a subtle warning without saying much at all. She simply placed a hand on the narrator's arm one afternoon and offered a tired expression, a look that said she had seen this happen before, and it never ended gently. Yet within her eyes was something else, hope that maybe this time would be different. The narrator continued gathering evidence. The HOA bylaws were filled with ambiguous language, phrases like aesthetic harmony and neighborhood character that were broad enough to be interpreted in multiple ways. Ambiguity was a tool. Corporations used it. Institutions used it. And Harold used it to maintain selective authority. But what Harold did not anticipate was that ambiguity was also a weakness in legal structure. When rules are not applied equally, they lose their enforceability. And once enforceability is questioned, authority begins to fracture. The narrator sat down one evening with all the collected materials laid neatly across a dining table. Letters, photographs, copies of public records, and notes formed clear patterns. Dates aligned with meetings. Fines aligned with personal conflicts. Budgets reflected discrepancies. The image was no longer subtle, it was undeniable. But the narrator knew this was only half preparation. To confront Harold and the HOA board effectively, the narrator needed two things: timing and audience. A challenge brought too soon would be brushed aside or buried in procedural delay. A confrontation brought too late would allow Harold time to regroup and fortify his power. The confrontation needed to occur in a setting where Harold expected compliance, where his confidence would be highest. That place was the monthly HOA meeting. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, the narrator remained outwardly calm. The mailbox was checked, the lawn edged, the house maintained to perfection. No additional conflict was invited. Silence, in this moment, was a strategy. Meanwhile, the narrator filed an official request under the association's transparency requirement. The HOA was legally obligated to provide financial statements and board meeting minutes. Harold, confident and accustomed to compliance, handed them over without hesitation. The financial reports were even more revealing than expected. Funds for neighborhood maintenance had been spent on consultation fees that appeared repeatedly, yet no consultant names were listed. Money allocated for common area improvements had been redirected under vague expense labels. And once again, the inconsistencies lined up with the dates of homeowner disputes. The narrator had not only proof of selective enforcement, but possible misuse of HOA funds. The narrator prepared a statement, not a passionate speech, but a methodical presentation. Facts, laws, recorded patterns, and evidence tied together in a way that would be impossible to refute. This would not be an argument. It would be an unveiling. As the night of the HOA meeting approached, the neighborhood seemed to shift in quiet anticipation. Some residents sensed tension brewing, though none could pinpoint the source. Harold walked the sidewalks with the confidence of someone who believed he held the entire neighborhood in the palm of his hand. He had no reason to think anything was changing. The narrator sat calmly on the evening before the meeting, the documents stacked in a folder on the table. There was no anger, no anxiety, only focus. Justice, after all, is not loud. It is precise. The narrator knew that in less than 24 hours, the balance of power in the neighborhood would begin to tilt. But the true shift would not happen in a single moment. It would unfold carefully, steadily, and undeniably. The narrator closed the folder and turned off the light, ready for what came next. The stage had been set. The evening of the HOA meeting arrived without ceremony, yet the air felt different. The sun dipped behind the rows of houses, casting long shadows across neatly manicured lawns, as residents made their way toward the community center. Most came out of routine more than interest. These meetings were usually uneventful, filled with mundane discussions about seasonal landscaping schedules and reminders about parking regulations. But tonight, There was a quiet undercurrent that suggested something was about to change, though only one person present fully understood how. The narrator arrived calmly, carrying a simple folder tucked under one arm. There was no visible tension, no dramatic energy. Just steady composure. This was not a confrontation born from anger, but an action grounded in truth. And truth did not need theatrics to be powerful. The meeting room was arranged in its usual manner, folding chairs aligned in orderly rows, a long table at the front where the board members sat, and a projector screen that was rarely used. Harold, wearing an expression of self-appointed authority, greeted familiar residents with warm, practiced smiles. His posture was confident, his demeanor controlled. He believed he was respected. In reality, most of the respect he received was simply compliance disguised as admiration. Harold took his seat at the center of the board table, tapping a small wooden gavel that he seemed to enjoy more than necessary. He began the meeting with predictable structure, attendance confirmation, approval of last meeting's minutes, and announcements regarding upcoming neighborhood maintenance schedules. The residents listened with polite disinterest. They were used to this cadence, to this pattern of formality. But the narrator's presence had not gone unnoticed. Some residents glanced over occasionally, sensing something unspoken. They had seen the stream of HOA envelopes. They suspected what those envelopes represented. And a quiet hope flickered in some of their eyes, the hope that someone finally intended to push back. As the meeting continued, Harold transitioned into the enforcement review section, where he discussed community compliance issues. He mentioned lawn heights, mailbox maintenance, and other typical concerns. And then, in a tone layered with arrogance only barely concealed beneath a mask of professionalism, he referenced a homeowner who has repeatedly failed to comply with community standards. He didn't name the narrator directly, but the implication was unmistakable. This was the moment the narrator had been waiting for. Calmly and without hesitation, the narrator raised a hand, a simple gesture that carried more weight in its quietness than any raised voice could have. Harold acknowledged it, though his expression shifted slightly, revealing faint irritation. He was not accustomed to being interrupted. He expected compliance, not response. The narrator stood and approached the front table, placing the folder down with deliberate precision. There was no rush, no urgency, only clarity. The narrator began to speak, not emotionally, but analytically. The words were measured, structured, and firm. The room fell silent as residents realized this was not a typical homeowner complaint. This was something else entirely. The narrator explained the history of the fines, the repeated notices, and the selective enforcement that affected some residents while others were exempt. Then came the documentation. Photographs of neighboring properties with clear violations. Lists of dates. Corresponding HOA notices, or lack thereof. The evidence painted a pattern that could no longer be disguised. The rules were not being enforced equally. Harold attempted to interject, but the narrator continued, calmly, professionally. The narrator referenced the HOA's own bylaws, citing sections that required equal application of rules and transparent enforcement standards. The legal language was precise and irrefutable. And then came the financial records. Copies of expenditures that lacked documentation. Repeated budget entries listed under vague descriptions. Funds allocated for neighborhood improvement that had no visible result. The narrator did not accuse. The narrator presented. The distinction was significant. Accusations can be denied. Evidence cannot. The residents began shifting in their seats. Whispers spread in quiet waves. Expressions shifted from confusion to realization to concern. And for the first time in many years, Harold's confidence began to crack. The narrator concluded by stating that unless immediate corrective action was taken, both regarding enforcement practices and financial transparency, formal legal action would be pursued. There was no threat in the narrator's tone. Only certainty. Silence followed. A silence so heavy it felt like the air itself had changed. One of the board members, previously always aligned with Harold, looked down at the table, visibly unsettled. Another leaned back cautiously, distancing himself as if recognizing the foundation beneath Harold was weakening. The residents began to understand that this was not a personal dispute. It was the unveiling of a system that had operated unchecked for far too long. Harold attempted to regain control, suggesting that these concerns be reviewed at a later date. But the narrator calmly reminded him, and the room, that HOA bylaws required immediate vote when enforcement validity was challenged with documented evidence. And now the entire neighborhood had witnessed the documentation. The board, tense and unsure, moved to vote. Their voices lacked the confidence they once held. And for the first time since Harold assumed leadership, the vote did not align with his wishes. The residents voted to suspend enforcement actions pending full review. Then they voted to open a formal audit of HOA finances. And then, most unexpectedly, they voted to call for a special election regarding the position of HOA president. Harold sat quietly now, the clipboard tucked against his chest like a shield that no longer protected him. His authority had not been taken loudly. It had not been taken with anger. It had been undone with logic, patience, and clarity. The meeting adjourned soon after, leaving the room heavy with the sense that something irreversible had begun. The narrator walked home slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of awareness. This was not the end. It was only the first turning point. Systems do not crumble in a single moment, they unravel piece by piece. The folder remained tucked under the narrator's arm, no longer a tool of preparation, but now a symbol of quiet momentum. The next phase would not be as visible. It would move into deeper territory: motives, history, accountability. The neighborhood had taken its first breath of freedom. But Harold was not the type to accept defeat gently. The real battle was only beginning. The days following the HOA meeting felt noticeably different in the neighborhood. There was a shift in the air, subtle yet undeniable. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now nodded with cautious respect. Others lingered a bit longer while collecting mail, perhaps waiting for the narrator to speak first. Not everyone approved of what had happened at the meeting, but everyone felt its impact. A balance had changed. A foundation had moved. But change does not come without resistance. And Harold was not a man who accepted loss quietly. At first, the shift was quiet. He maintained his morning walks, though his pace was quicker and his shoulders more rigid. He no longer held his clipboard comfortably at his side, but closer to his chest, as though it were armor. His expression carried something new, not authority, but watchfulness. He was no longer surveying the neighborhood to enforce order. He was searching for threats. Harold had spent years building influence in the HOA. He had done so not through cooperation or leadership, but through persistence and control. He attended every meeting. He reviewed every document. He ensured he was involved in every decision. And, over time, the neighborhood simply accepted his presence as constant, permanent, unquestioned. Authority, when unchallenged long enough, begins to resemble truth. But truth has a different weight. And now that his authority had been questioned publicly, the structure he built no longer felt as stable. The narrator began to notice signs of Harold's counterstrike. The first came in the form of sudden neighborhood chatter, subtle rumors suggesting the narrator was overly confrontational, uncooperative, aggressive. These whispers were designed to erode credibility, to shift perception. People who had once felt hopeful now felt uncertain. But rumors carry little weight when grounded in nothing but fear. The next came in the form of policy proposals. Harold called for an emergency board gathering, not the open meeting kind, but the private kind, where decisions were made before being presented as final. Yet board members were no longer willing to offer him unquestioning support. The narrator had exposed their vulnerability by showing the rules could be reviewed, evaluated, confronted. The board members now understood that aligning too closely with Harold could place them in jeopardy as well. Still, Harold did not back down. Instead, he attempted something more direct. He filed a formal notice against the narrator for creating a hostile environment toward HOA leadership. The claim was baseless, vague, and unsupported by any documented interaction. But its purpose was not enforcement. Its purpose was retaliation. To show that even cornered, he could still strike. The narrator received the letter in silence, placing it gently atop a growing stack of documentation. There was no frustration. No sense of surprise. Retaliation, when predictable, loses its ability to intimidate. The narrator's focus turned instead to the internal audit that had been approved. Because while Harold worked to reclaim personal authority, the audit began revealing something deeper. The assigned auditor, a third-party professional requested by several concerned residents, reviewed years of HOA financial records. Month by month, line by line. The first report revealed inconsistencies, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Payments listed under community improvement, with no corresponding receipts. Fees collected for neighborhood events that never occurred. And the most telling detail, repeated transfers into an account controlled solely by Harold. The neighborhood had been paying for more than rules and structure. They had been funding control. As the audit progressed, tension in the neighborhood thickened. Some residents feared what this meant. Others felt vindicated. The elderly neighbor who had once placed a hand on the narrator's arm watched with quiet understanding, as though she had seen many battles like this play out before. The narrator continued gathering, reviewing, preparing, not only to address what was unfolding, but for what would come next. Because Harold was spiraling. He had once believed the rules protected him. But now, the rules had become evidence. And evidence does not take sides. His behavior shifted from careful control to frantic maintenance. He began visiting houses where support had been fading, attempting to convince homeowners that the neighborhood would fall apart without his guidance. He tried to paint himself as protector, not oppressor. But desperation cannot be disguised. And desperation rarely inspires loyalty. The narrator watched from a distance, not to gloat, but to understand. This was not a fight that required aggression. It required clarity, patience, and precision. The narrator had spent years in courtrooms where emotions were layered beneath legal arguments. This situation was no different. The narrator knew that final resolutions are rarely dramatic moments. They are the result of consistent, quiet steps, each one deliberate. The special election date was scheduled. And that was when Harold made his most revealing move. He attempted to revise the HOA bylaws before the election. The revisions included new requirements for board eligibility, requirements that would conveniently disqualify the narrator from running or voting. The changes were written urgently, without proper procedural notice. It was a last attempt to secure authority by rewriting the very structure designed to limit it. But the narrator had anticipated this. HOA bylaws, like any governing document, were tied to state law. And state law required public posting and majority vote before any revision could take effect. Harold had ignored that requirement, which meant his attempted revisions were invalid before they were even reviewed. The narrator drafted a formal response to the board, citing statute numbers, case references, and the exact procedural violations committed. The language was professional, controlled, unyielding, not emotional, legal. The board had no choice but to accept the correction. And the attempted revisions were voided. The narrator had not only defended against Harold's move but had demonstrated, again, that authority was only as strong as the legitimacy behind it. Harold's certainty had now eroded into fear. His morning walks stopped. His clipboard no longer left his home. The neighborhood no longer saw a figure of leadership. They saw a man who had mistaken control for respect, and who was losing both. The stage was shifting toward the inevitable final confrontation, the special election. But the narrator knew the final battle would not be fought in a meeting room, or through letters, or even through procedural votes. It would be fought in the one place Harold never expected to be challenged: a courtroom. The weeks leading up to the special election unfolded with a quiet but powerful intensity. The neighborhood, once subdued under the weight of compliance, now seemed to carry an undercurrent of alertness. Conversations took place in driveways, around kitchen tables, and beside mailboxes. People who once said nothing now compared stories, Stories of fines they never questioned, expenses they never understood, and authority they never realized they could challenge. But while the neighborhood slowly reclaimed its voice, Harold sank further into silence. The facade of strength he once displayed had fractured. The morning walks stopped entirely. The clipped, forced pleasantries were gone. Occasionally, his blinds would shift just slightly, revealing the briefest glimpse of him watching as the narrator walked past, but he no longer stepped outside to inspect. He was waiting. Not for acceptance. Not for resolution. He was waiting for the last move he believed would save him. And that move came in the form of a lawsuit. One morning, in a plain white envelope placed deliberately in the narrator's mailbox, a summons appeared. The HOA, under Harold's direction, was suing the narrator for disrupting community operations and damaging the HOA's credibility. The claim was flimsy, poorly structured, and padded with vague accusations. But its purpose was not to win. It was to intimidate, to overwhelm, to make the narrator retreat. But intimidation works only when the recipient lacks preparation. And the narrator had been preparing from the very beginning. The narrator read the claim slowly, analyzing every word. There were inconsistencies in the filing. Sections cited incorrectly. Procedural steps skipped entirely. It was sloppy work, rushed, panicked, desperate. It was not the lawsuit of a confident leader. It was the lawsuit of a man clinging to whatever power he still believed he had. When the court date was scheduled, the narrator felt a familiar stillness settle in, one that had preceded countless legal hearings in the past. A stillness not of fear, but of discipline. Courtrooms were not places of argument. They were places of structure. And structure favors those who understand it. The day arrived quietly. The courthouse was modest, built more for local disputes than dramatic legal battles. Yet the gravity of the moment did not rely on grandeur. Harold arrived with a forced composure that did little to hide the tension in his posture. He spoke in short sentences to the attorney he had hired, an attorney clearly unfamiliar with the deeper context of the case. The narrator arrived without spectacle, carrying the same organized folder used from the beginning. Inside were records, photographs, correspondence, financial documentation, and a copy of the HOA bylaws printed, highlighted, and bookmarked. When the hearing began, Harold's attorney presented the case first. The argument attempted to frame the narrator as a disruptive resident who threatened the unity and function of the community. The attorney spoke of maintaining order, of preserving community standards, and of protecting the authority of the HOA. But authority without integrity carries no legal weight. Then the narrator spoke. The voice was calm, clear, measured. There was no anger, no urgency. The narrator did not defend personal actions. Instead, the narrator shifted the focus to the legality of the HOA's behavior. The selective enforcement. The procedural violations. The financial discrepancies. Every statement was supported by documented evidence. The courtroom grew quiet, not out of tension, but out of clarity. The narrative had changed. This was no longer a dispute between a resident and an association. It was the revealing of a system misused. The judge listened intently, asking only occasional questions. The narrator responded with precision. Not just as a resident, but as someone who understood the law deeper than Harold ever did. When the narrator presented the financial inconsistencies, the room shifted. The judge requested clarification. Receipts were missing. Audit findings were incomplete. Funds had indeed been moved without transparent record. Harold did not speak, but his expression said everything. He had not expected the fight to reach this depth. He had believed intimidation was enough. He had believed authority alone would protect him. But authority without accountability is fragile. The judge ruled decisively. The lawsuit was dismissed entirely. The HOA was ordered to cease fines against the narrator, and the audit was legally mandated to continue, with oversight. But the final statement from the judge carried the most impact. If further financial misuse was found, not only could Harold be removed from his position, he could face civil penalties. The courtroom emptied slowly. Harold did not look at the narrator. He walked away with hurried, uneven steps, disappearing down the hallway. His rhythm of control had finally broken. Outside, the air felt different. Not triumphant. Not victorious. Clear. The next days in the neighborhood were quiet, not with tension, but with reflection. Word of the court ruling spread quickly. Residents no longer whispered. They knocked on doors, asked questions, shared stories of moments they once felt powerless to speak about. And when the day of the special election arrived, the turnout was the largest the neighborhood had ever seen. Ballots were cast. Names were marked. And the final count was not close. Harold was removed from the presidency. But the narrator did not run for the position. Power had never been the goal. Instead, a resident known for fairness and community involvement was elected, a person who believed that leadership was about guidance, not control. The neighborhood began to rebuild, slowly and quietly. Rules remained, but they were now applied with consistency and respect. Conversations replaced warnings. Cooperation replaced fear. Yet the story was not finished. Because the audit was still ongoing. And while the narrator no longer needed to lead the charge publicly, there was still one final chapter unfolding beneath the surface. A chapter where consequences would meet action. A chapter where accountability could no longer be avoided. The neighborhood had begun to heal. But Harold's reckoning had only just begun. The courtroom felt colder than any room the homeowner had ever stood in. Not because of the temperature, but because of what the space represented. Accountability. People who had acted without consequence were finally being seen under the full, unobstructed light of the law. The HOA president sat at the defendant's table with a wide-eyed stiffness, the kind of frozen posture that appeared when a person finally realized they were no longer in control of the narrative. His confidence, once overflowing and abrasive, had retreated into something small and shrunken. The homeowner sat at the plaintiff's table, calm and still, hands folded neatly. There was no smugness, no gloating, no visible satisfaction. Only a quiet, steady purpose. He hadn't come to destroy a person. He had come to stop harm. To protect his home, his peace, his dignity, and the dignity of every person who had been harassed, bullied, or exploited under the presumption that no one would ever challenge authority. The judge entered, and the room rose. The tone was set with a seriousness that required no performance. When seated again, proceedings began. Opening statements were read. Evidence packets were distributed. It was clear the judge had already reviewed the filings beforehand, and awareness was already written across her face. The homeowner's filings had been meticulously documented. Dates, photos, messages, copies of HOA bylaw sections, and financial records proving misuse of power and funds. The HOA president's filings were thin, scattered, and in some parts contradictory. The first hour was a dissection. Not dramatic, not loud. Just quiet, methodical unraveling. The HOA president had no attorney, he had believed one wasn't necessary. But the homeowner, being a lawyer himself, had come prepared with a complete and orderly presentation of wrongdoing. Every false fine, every intimidation attempt, every attempt to manipulate and isolate residents. Pages of testimonies from neighbors were entered into record, many submitted anonymously out of fear of retaliation, but all legally valid. The president's defense crumbled quickly. He tried to insist he was only maintaining community standards, but the evidence showed inconsistencies that could not be brushed aside. One resident fined for a garden bed while another with a larger one had never been issued notice. One homeowner prohibited from painting their shutters while another had been allowed. The selective enforcement told a story of power used not fairly, but personally. And the finances, the true weight of the case, revealed personal purchases charged to HOA funds, including landscaping work performed only on the president's property. The judge listened carefully, saying little, but her expression sharpened whenever another inconsistency surfaced. The neighbors in the gallery sat still, their faces pale with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. Many had suspected, but seeing it laid out in full was sobering. When the homeowner spoke directly to the court, his tone remained steady and controlled. He explained that HOAs were meant to preserve shared spaces and common standards, not to grant absolute control to individuals seeking to rule their neighbors. He emphasized that rules were only as fair as the people enforcing them, and that power, when left unchecked, always revealed character. The HOA president's replies were restless, disorganized, occasionally sharp with frustration. He was not a man accustomed to being questioned. The courtroom made that dynamic painfully visible. The ruling, when delivered, was thorough. The judge declared the fines issued to the homeowner null and void. The HOA president was ordered to reimburse the association for misused funds. A formal audit of the HOA's financial records was ordered. The president was removed from his position effective immediately. And because the misuse of authority had been deliberate and repeated, a civil penalty was imposed. The sound in the room was not shock. It was relief. The HOA president sat still in his chair, his expression blank, as if suddenly disconnected from the outcome. There was no dramatic outburst, no final excuse. Only silence, the silence of realization. When everyone stood to leave, the president did not move at first. He simply stared forward, as though the world around him had shifted in a way he could not yet comprehend. The homeowner walked past him without a word, without even a glance. Revenge was not in the final blow. Revenge had always been in the refusal to be intimidated. Outside the courthouse, the neighbors gathered. Some offered thanks. Some apologized for not speaking sooner. Some simply stood close, the kind of closeness that forms only when people have endured something together. The homeowner accepted their words gently. He did not blame them for their silence. Fear can be quiet but powerful. The following weeks brought change to the neighborhood. The new interim HOA leadership held open meetings. Rules were reviewed. Votes were transparent. Communication was posted clearly for all residents to see. The atmosphere shifted into something lighter, less tense, less lurking with the possibility of conflict. And the homeowner's yard remained exactly as it had been. Simple, clean, with the same garden bed that had sparked the HOA president's spiral into overreach. Sometimes, while watering the plants, the homeowner thought about how small the initial conflict had been, and how telling the escalation ultimately became. Authority is a tool. In the right hands, it builds fairness. In the wrong hands, it corrodes trust. The HOA president had believed power meant immunity. He had forgotten that power is accountable to the law, and to the people it governs. The homeowner did not seek praise. There were no celebrations. Only peace, the restoration of a quiet life. The strongest victories are not loud. They are steady, enduring, unshaken. The lesson endures. Never assume someone can be bullied into silence. Never assume someone will not understand their rights. Never assume position equals control. And never, ever forget who you're dealing with. Especially when the person you're trying to intimidate is a lawyer.